Do you remember the smell of a Sunday roast that started before you even opened your eyes? Not a slow cooker, not a timer set the night before, a real pot on a real stove tended by a real woman who had been standing in that kitchen since before the sun came up. You could smell it from your bedroom. Pot roast maybe 69 cents a pound from the butcher down on the corner, and your mother made it stretch across 6 plates like it was the easiest thing in the world. How did she do it? That is the question that has been sitting in the back of your chest for a long time now. How did something born from so little end up tasting so much like everything? Today we are going back, all the way back to the 1950s, to the houses, the kitchens, the schoolyards, the porches, the 5-and-dime stores, and the long summer evenings when the whole neighborhood was outside until the streetlights came on. We are going to walk through 20 things from that world, 20 memories that shape the people who are watching this right now. And by the time we reach the last one, I think you're going to remember something you did not even know you had forgotten. Stay with me through all 20, because number one, the very last thing we talk about today holds a truth about that era that nobody has ever been willing to say plainly out loud. I have been saving it, and I think it is the most important thing in this whole video. But first, let me say something before we go any further. This is not a story about poverty. This is not a story about hardship. Though hardship was real, the people who lived through the Depression and then the war, they carried something into the 1950s that cannot be bought and cannot be taught. They carried the knowledge of how to make almost nothing into something warm, something nourishing, something that the whole family would remember for the rest of their lives. That is not lack, that is ingenuity, that is love, applied with both hands, and it is worth being proud of. Number 20, the milkman. Do you remember hearing the bottles on the porch before the rest of the house was awake? Glass bottles, cold and fogged over, set down quiet as a secret by a man who had been up since well before 4 in the morning. By the early 1950s, most of America still had home milk delivery. The milkman came to your street, knew your family's order by heart, and left those bottles right at your door, sometimes in a little insulated box, sometimes just on the step. Some older homes even had a small door built right into the outside wall of the kitchen, a milk door. They called it, just wide enough for the bottles to slide through, so the milkman never had to set foot inside. The cream rose to the top of every bottle. Real cream, you could see it thick and golden, sitting above the white. On a cold morning, you might find it pushed halfway up out of the bottle from the freezing. The cream had expanded right through the cap. Your mother would skim it off for her coffee. Your father might pour it on his oatmeal. Nothing went to waste. Not one drop. By the mid-1950s, glass bottles were beginning to give way to paper cartons, and the milkman's days were quietly being numbered. Families were getting refrigerators, grocery stores were stocking more milk, and the daily delivery started to feel less necessary. But for a whole generation of children, the sound of those glass bottles on the porch step was the true sound of morning. It meant someone had already been up and working, thinking about your family, before you ever opened your eyes. When the milkman went away, we did not just lose a delivery, we lost a relationship. We lost a man who knew us. Number 19, the pantry. Every older home had one. Not a walk-in closet lined with wire shelves the way they build them today. A real pantry. A small room or a deep closet, or sometimes just a cool corner behind a proper door. Shelves on every wall, floor to ceiling, stocked with everything the family might need for a month without a trip to the store. Flour in a tin, sugar in a canister, row after row of home-canned tomatoes, green beans, peaches, corn, jars your grandmother put up herself in August while it was so hot in that kitchen you could barely breathe because she knew January was coming. The pantry was not decorating. The pantry was survival, made orderly and dignified by the 1950s, though with better refrigerators coming into more and more homes, and with processed foods arriving on grocery shelves in bright new packages, the pantry began to disappear from American home design. Builders stopped including them, families stopped needing them, or thought they did. The shelves of home-canned goods gave way to cabinets of Campbell's soup and boxes of Jell-O. There is nothing wrong with Campbell's soup, but there is something lost when a family no longer has a room that says, we planned ahead, we put things by, we can feed ourselves through whatever comes. The pantry was a statement of self-reliance. Every jar on those shelves was a small act of defiance against uncertainty. If you grew up with a pantry in the house, you know that smell. Cool air, a little dusty, a little sweet from the fruit preserves, a little sharp from the vinegar of the pickles. It smelled like safety. Nobody builds that into a house anymore. Number 18, the Sunday dinner table. It was not negotiable. Sunday dinner was not optional. It was not something you worked around your schedule. Your schedule worked around it. Every Sunday after church, and you went to church, that was also not optional. The whole family sat down together at the table. That was only set that way once a week, with the good plates, with the cloth napkins your mother ironed herself, with the food that had been going since morning. Pot roast was the great Sunday standard. In 1957, a pot roast ran about 69 cents a pound at the butcher. Your mother would buy maybe 3 pounds, stretch it with potatoes, carrots, onions, and whatever else needed using up, and feed 6 people without a second thought. The roast went in before church. It cooked on low while the family was gone. When you came through the door, the whole house was already warm with it. That deep, dark, slow smell of beef and browned onion and gravy beginning to form on its own at the bottom of the pot. There was bread always. A loaf of bread in 1952 cost 12 cents in Florida. 12 cents. You bought it every few days, and you used every slice, including the heel, especially the heel. Nobody threw away the heel of bread. The heel went to whoever needed a little something between now and supper. It was buttered and eaten standing at the counter, and it was just as good as any other piece. The Sunday table was not about the food, though the food was very good. It was about the hour. It was about everyone sitting still in the same room, looking at each other. There was no television on, there was no radio, there was just the family and the meal, and the slow passage of a Sunday afternoon. We gave that up, and I'm not sure we noticed until it was long gone. Number 17, the 5 and dime store. Woolworths, Kresge's, McCrory's, Ben Franklin. If you grew up in an American town in the 1950s, you knew one of these by name. The 5 and dime was on the main street of every town, and it was one of the great democratic institutions of American life. Everything in it cost very little. The counters were long and low, and you could see everything laid out right in front of you: sewing notions, candy, bobby pins, small toys, pencils, dish towels, pocket combs. The soda fountain at the Woolworth's lunch counter was a thing of beauty. You could sit on a round stool that spun, order a cherry Coke or a grilled cheese sandwich, and spend 45 minutes over lunch for less than a quarter. A bottle of Coca-Cola in the 1950s cost 5 cents. 5 cents, and nobody drank it in a hurry, because you had nowhere to be. That was more important than right there. The lunch counter at Woolworth's would later become something else entirely. Those same counters in 1960 became the site of the sit-in protests in Greensboro, North Carolina, when 4 young black college students sat down and refused to leave. But in the 1950s, for a child with a dime in her pocket, the 5 and dime was just the place where everything you wanted lived at a price your allowance could reach. They are all gone now. Every one of them. Woolworth's closed its last American store in 1997. Kresge's became Kmart and then mostly disappeared. The buildings are still there in a lot of towns. You can tell them by the wide windows and the old tile floors. But the lunch counters are gone, and the spinning stools and the nickel candy, and the whole unhurried idea of a store where nothing cost very much and everyone was welcome. Number 16. Playing outside until dark. Do you remember the rule? Not a curfew, not a schedule. Just be home when the streetlights come on. That was the whole rule. And from the time school let out in the afternoon until that moment, you were free. You were free in a way that children today almost cannot imagine. Free to roam 3 or 4 blocks in any direction. To knock on a friend's door, to play in a vacant lot. To build something out of scrap wood behind the garage. Nobody was watching you through a phone. Nobody was tracking you. The whole neighborhood was your territory, and you knew every yard and every dog and every family along your route. Summer evenings in the 1950s had a particular quality of light, long and golden and slow, lasting right up until 9 o'clock in July. You could play kick the can or hide and seek in that light with a dozen kids from 4 different families, until the air started to cool and the fireflies came up from the grass. Then somebody's mother would lean out the back door and call a name, and slowly, one by one, the children peeled off and went home, and the street went quiet. Nobody organized it, nobody scheduled it, nobody drove you there, you just went out, and the neighborhood received you and took care of you in its loose, unspoken way. That is something we traded for safety, and I'm not sure we got the better end of that trade. Number 15. The Icebox and the Iceman. For many families at the very start of the 1950s, the electric refrigerator was still new. Ice deliveries across the country had continued right into the late 1940s and even into the early 1950s in some rural areas. The iceman came to the back door with a big block on a pair of tongs over his shoulder, and he loaded it into the top of the icebox while the kitchen smelled briefly of cold and wet sawdust. Then he was gone, and the ice melted slowly through the week, keeping the food below it just cold enough. By 1950, most city families had an electric refrigerator, but the habits of the icebox generation lingered. You did not let food sit. You did not buy more than you could use. You planned the week's meals around what was already in the box, and you used the older things first without being told. Waste was not a moral failing. It was just not something that happened, because there had been too many years when you could not afford for it to happen. The refrigerator was a miracle, and people knew it was a miracle. Your grandmother might still call it the icebox, out of habit. The way people today still say they are going to tape a show when there is no tape involved. The word outlasted the thing it named. And in that little slip of language, you can hear the whole long distance the family had traveled, from the block of ice in the kitchen to the humming white box that kept the milk cold without anyone lifting a finger. Number 14. The butcher shop. The supermarket was growing in the 1950s. By the middle of the decade, chains were spreading into suburbs all across the country, but in a lot of neighborhoods, especially in towns and cities, you still had a butcher, a real one. A man in a white apron who knew your name, who knew what your family liked, who would tell you which cut was good this week and which one to avoid. You could buy a chuck roast for 59 cents a pound in Florida in 1952. Chicken was 43 cents a pound in New Hampshire in 1950. Hamburger meat was 89 cents for 3 full pounds in Ohio in 1957. These were not luxury prices, even for a family on a working man's wage. A man earning 75 cents an hour, the minimum wage in 1950, could feed his family on a week's groceries for $4 or $5. If he was careful and his wife knew what she was doing in that kitchen. And she did. She always did. The cuts nobody else wanted were the cuts that fed the most people: neck bones, oxtail, chicken feet, the pig's foot. These were the cuts that simmered the longest and gave the most. All that collagen and marrow going slowly into the broth, making it rich and thick and deeply flavored in a way that a chicken breast never could. Your grandmother knew this. She did not buy those cuts because she had no choice. She bought them because she knew what they became after 6 hours on a low flame, tender gold, as good as anything. The butcher let her. He knew exactly what she was doing. And he saved those cuts for the women who would use them right. Number 13, the front porch. Every house had one. Not a deck in the backyard where you sat in private. A front porch facing the street where you sat in public and let the neighborhood pass by in front of you. It was the social infrastructure of the 1950s, and it required nothing. No reservation, no invitation, no plan. You just went out and sat down, and sooner or later someone walked by or a neighbor came out onto their own porch, and you talked across the space between you. The front porch was where the older people held court. Your grandmother on her porch on a summer evening, in a chair she had been sitting in for 30 years, watching the street with the calm authority of someone who had seen everything that street had to offer and was not surprised by any of it. She knew every family. She knew every child by first name. She knew who was struggling and who had just gotten good news and who needed a word said to them, and she said it kindly without being asked. In the 1950s, television began pulling families off the front porch and into the living room. TV ownership went from 9% of American homes in 1950 to 90% by 1959, 9 years. That is astonishing. In less than a decade, most of American family life moved from facing out toward the street to facing in toward a screen. The front porch did not disappear overnight, but it began to empty, slowly, one family at a time. And when it did, the neighborhood changed in ways nobody named at the time. Number 12, the school lunch. There was one thing on the tray and you ate it. That was the whole system. The National School Lunch Act had passed in 1946, and by the early 1950s it was in full operation. Hot meals, subsidized by the government, served in cafeterias across the country. You got a main dish, a vegetable, a fruit or dessert, and a half pint of cold milk. There was no menu, there was no choice. You ate what was served and you finished it, because finishing your plate was simply what you did. For a lot of children, that school lunch was the most reliable hot meal of the day. Families were stretched. Fathers were working long hours at wages that left not much extra. Mothers were home managing the house on whatever came in. For a child from a family that was tight that week, the school cafeteria was not just food, it was stability. It was the certainty of one warm thing, every weekday, without fail. The ladies who ran those cafeterias were not celebrated. They were not on TV. They were women who got up early, cooked in quantity, and fed hundreds of children by noon, 5 days a week, for wages that would seem impossible. Now they knew the hungry children by sight. They gave second helpings quietly, without making anything of it. They understood what they were really doing, even if nobody around them did. Number 11, the sewing room or the sewing basket. Not every home had a room set aside for it, but every home had the sewing itself. A basket by the chair, a drawer full of thread in every color, needles wrapped in flannel, a thimble worn smooth on the right middle finger. If something tore, you mended it. If something wore through at the elbow, you patched it. If a child outgrew a dress, you let out the hem, and then let it out again, and then made it into something for the younger one. Clothing in the 1950s was not expensive by the standards of what people earned. A woman's dress could be had for $20 or $30, but it was not disposable either. You did not throw away a shirt because a button came off. You sewed the button back on. You did not replace curtains because they faded. You bleached them or you turned them or you made them into something else. The fabric was the resource, and a resourceful woman did not waste it. The sewing machine was the most important appliance in many homes, more used than the TV, more essential than the radio. It ran every week. It turned flour sacks into aprons, old sheets into pillow slips, a man's worn-out shirt into a child's play clothes. Nothing that could still be made into something useful was thrown out. The women who worked those machines were engineers in the truest sense. They were solving a problem with the materials at hand, and the solution lasted for years. Number 10, the root cellar or the storm cellar. Out in the country, and in a lot of small towns too, the root cellar was as important as the kitchen. It was underground, dug into the earth where the temperature stayed cool and steady, even in the hottest summer and the coldest winter. You went down those steps into the dark and the smell of soil, and down there on the wooden shelves were the winter's stores: potatoes, turnips, onions, apples packed in straw, crocks of sauerkraut, jars of everything your garden had grown in June and July and August. A 10-pound bag of potatoes cost 35 cents in Kansas in 1953. You might have 50 10-pound bags down there in that cellar. You might have more. You did not count on the store for everything, because the store might not have it, or the weather might keep you from getting there, or the money might run short. The cellar was the answer to all of those things at once. It was not fear that built those cellars. It was experience. The people who filled them had already seen what happened when you had nothing put by. In tornado country, the root cellar doubled as the storm cellar, and you knew exactly how long it took to get from the back door to those steps, because your mother had walked it with you until you could do it in the dark, in your sleep, without thinking. Number 9, making do, or the art of the almost nothing meal. This deserves its own moment because it is the heart of what this whole remembrance is really about. A pot of beans, a ham hock. Maybe 40 cents at the butcher, maybe less. A pot of beans with a ham hock simmering since morning costs less than 50 cents and feeds a family of 6. Cornbread made from a bag of cornmeal that cost a dime. Supper complete for less than $1, and it was good, not make-do good. Not apologetically good, actually good in the way that something cooked slow and with attention is always good regardless of what it cost. Fried green tomatoes from the garden. Biscuits made from scratch, 10 minutes flat, with lard from the can on the second shelf. Pinto beans and fatback. Chicken and dumplings made from one old hen that had stopped laying. Bread pudding from the heels that had gone a little stale. These were not poverty meals. These were the meals of people who understood food, who understood the way time and heat and a little fat transformed the most humble raw material into something worth sitting down for, and nobody wrote it down. It was not in a cookbook. It was in the hands of the woman who made it. In the muscle memory of 1,000 repetitions, passed from a mother to a daughter in the kitchen without ceremony, without a recipe, without a thought. because it was just dinner. It was just what you did. When we lost those women, we lost something that no cookbook can entirely put back. Number 8. The family garden. The victory gardens of World War II had ended, but a lot of families kept right on gardening into the 1950s because the garden made sense. A packet of seeds cost a few cents. The labor was your own and your children's, and from May through October, the garden fed your family things you could not buy quite as fresh or quite as good at any price. Tomatoes in August, warm from the vine, eaten standing right there in the garden, with a little salt from a shaker you had brought outside in your apron pocket. Green beans picked young, when they were tender, and put up in jars before the end of the day. Sweet corn pulled in the morning and cooked before noon, because your grandmother told you that the sugar begins turning to starch the moment it leaves the stalk, and you believed her, and she was right. The children weeded. They hated weeding. They did it anyway. You were given a row, and the row was your responsibility, and if the weeds won, it was on you, and everyone knew it. That is a kind of accountability that is not taught anywhere anymore. The accountability of a living thing in your care, something that will either grow or not depending on what you do with your time between now and harvest. The garden was education that felt nothing like school. And everything it grew tasted different from what the store sold. Richer, more real, more like itself, because you had been present for every inch of it. Number 7, the neighborhood itself. In the 1950s, your neighborhood was your world, not in a limiting way, in a rich way. The people within 4 blocks of your house were your community in the fullest sense. They watched your children, they lent you sugar, they brought food when someone was sick. They stood at the back fence and talked in a way that was not efficient or brief, but was deeply human. New suburbs like Levittown in New York were going up in the early 1950s, offering affordable homes to returning veterans and their families, with streets and neighbors and the whole architecture of a new kind of American life. But whether you lived in a suburb or a small town or a city neighborhood, the assumption was the same. The people near you were known to you, and you to them, and that knowing was a form of safety that did not cost anything and could not be replaced by anything. You knew your neighbor's schedule. You knew which house had a new baby and which one had a sick husband and which one was running low at the end of the month. That knowledge was not gossip. It was the living network of a community functioning as it was supposed to function, watching, helping, quietly making sure that nobody fell through entirely without someone noticing. We moved away from that. We moved to different cities for jobs. We built taller fences. We started driving our garages with automatic doors so we never had to see the neighbor at all. We traded the knowing for the privacy, and now a lot of people sit alone in houses full of appliances and cannot name a single person on their street. Number 6, the radio hour. Before TV took over the living room, and the takeover happened fast, faster than almost anyone remembers. The radio was the family's window on the world. You sat in the same room, all of you, and you listened. Not to different things on different devices, to the same thing together. In the early 1950s, families gathered for radio programs the way they would later gather for television. The programs had time, long, unhurried time, filled with voices and music and stories that asked your imagination to do some of the work. A child listening to a radio drama built the whole picture in her head. The room, the faces, the weather outside the window. Every child built it a little differently, and that difference was the gift. Your imagination was exercised every single evening. By 1959, 9 out of 10 American homes had a TV set. The radio was not gone, but it had moved to the kitchen, to the car, to the bedroom. The family listening hour ended. Something quiet and good ended with it. Something that asked more of you than a picture on a screen and gave you more back as a result. Number 5, the clothesline. Maybe this sounds small, but stay with me for a moment. On a Monday morning in any American neighborhood in the 1950s, the clotheslines went up like flags. Sheets, shirts, work pants, children's dresses, all of it pegged out in the sun and the wind, in a particular order that every woman in the neighborhood understood without being told. Whites together, colors together. Never hang a man's shirts inside out. Someone had once said, and nobody could remember who, but nobody did it. Laundry took most of a Monday. The wringer washing machine, then the rinse, then the wringing again, then out to the line. In winter, the sheets froze stiff on the line, and you brought them in like boards and stood them in the kitchen to thaw. In summer, the wind dried everything in an hour, and it came in smelling of the exact air of that particular day. Sun and clover, and the specific outdoor smell of clean fabric that no dryer sheet has ever genuinely replicated. There was a rhythm to it. Not a pleasant rhythm, not in the way that word gets used now to mean enjoyable. A real rhythm. The rhythm of physical work repeated until it becomes fluent, until your hands know what to do without your mind having to direct them. That kind of work does something to a person. It connects you to the day, to the season, to the materials of your life, and when it was done, everything you owned was clean, and you had done it yourself, and that was not nothing. Number 4. Church and what came after. For most families in the 1950s, Sunday had a shape, and church was its beginning. You put on the good clothes. The children's shoes were polished the night before. The girls had their hair done. The boys wore their ties without complaint, or at least without saying it out loud. You walked or drove to the church your family had attended for years. Sometimes the same church your parents had attended. Sometimes the same one your grandparents had helped build. The church was not just the service, it was the hour before standing outside talking and the hour after talking more. It was the potluck dinners in the fellowship hall on the second Sunday of the month, where every woman brought her best dish: deviled eggs, potato salad, ham, green bean casserole, sweet potato pie, and the table was so full that the plates overlapped and you had to make 2 circuits just to see everything available. And nobody was competing. Or maybe everyone was a little, but in the way that made the table better rather than the room smaller. Your grandmother's coconut cake was famous in that congregation for 30 years. She made it without a recipe, from a method she had built in her own head, from her mother's method, adjusted over time. She made it for funerals too, and for new babies, and for when someone was sick. The cake was the language. It was the thing her hand said when her mouth did not have the words. Number 3. The walk to school. You walked, alone or with the kids from the next block, along a route you had memorized so completely it was like breathing a mile. Maybe a mile and a half, it did not seem long, because you had never had a shorter option. Your mother was not going to drive you. Nobody's mother drove them. Unless there was ice or the child had a broken leg, you walked in all weather with your books under your arm or in a satchel, and the walk itself was the beginning of the day. You knew things from that walk that you could not know any other way. You knew which yards had the good apples in September and whose dog was all bark. You knew which side of Elm Street got the most sun in February, and how early the Henderson's light came on in the morning. The walk gave you the neighborhood in a way that a car window never could, because walking is slow enough that the world has time to get into you. Dress codes enforced conformity, boys in pressed shirts, girls in skirts. Classrooms were full to overflowing with baby boom children. There were duck and cover drills that mixed Cold War anxiety into ordinary school days. But the walk there and back was yours, and it was free, and nobody managed it for you. Number 2, the summer kitchen, and what got canned. In August, in the South, in the Midwest, in any farmhouse or house with a garden, the summer kitchen ran from morning to night, putting up canning, preserving. Call it what you want, it was a serious operation, and everyone in the house had a role in it, down to the youngest child who could stir a pot or carry a jar. The jars came out of the cellar from last year, washed and inspected. The lids were new. You did not reuse lids. That was one rule that was firm. The tomatoes were blanched and peeled in a bucket of cold water, your fingers stained red by noon. The green beans were snapped by the dishpanful, snap, 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 the sound of it going all afternoon while someone talked and someone else listened, and the kitchen was hot and good-smelling and alive in a way that a kitchen full of people working together is alive. And by evening the jars were lined up on the counter. 40, 50, 60 quarts of tomatoes and beans and peaches and corn and apple butter and bread and butter pickles, sealed, cooling, making that small pinging sound as the lid sucked down and the seal was made. That ping was the sound of security. Every jar that pinged was one less thing to worry about come February. I want you to hold that image for one more moment before we get to number 1. 60 jars on the counter. 60 pings in the cooling evening kitchen. And the woman who put them there, tired, hands red, back aching, looking at them with a satisfaction so complete and so quiet that she did not need to name it. She just looked, and then she started washing up. That is who she was, and you came from her. And now, number 1. Here's the thing nobody was willing to say out loud. All of this, the pot roast for 69 cents, the clothesline on Monday, the walk to school, the pantry full of home-canned goods, the church potluck, the front porch, the milkman and the icebox and the garden and the root cellar and the sewing basket and the summer kitchen, all of it was built on the labor of women. Specifically on the labor of women who were never paid for it, were rarely thanked for it, were often not even seen performing it, because it was so constant and so woven into the fabric of daily life that it became invisible. Your grandmother did not clock in. There was no paycheck for the 60 jars of tomatoes, or the Sunday roast, or the mended shirts, or the school lunches packed at 6 in the morning, or the floors scrubbed on Friday so they were clean for the weekend. There was no performance review for the neighbor she fed when the neighbor's husband was out of work, or for the child she raised almost alone while her husband was at the plant from 7 to 5. She was not celebrated, she was not written about in newspapers, she was not on TV, she was just there every morning, doing the work that made everything else possible. Here is the quiet truth, the 1950s, the whole beautiful, warm, safe, Sunday-smelling, porch-sitting, clothesline flapping, root cellar full 1950s that we look back at with such tenderness. It ran on her. The whole thing ran on her. The ingenuity that stretched $4 into a week of meals was hers. The knowledge that turned the cheap cut into tender gold was hers. The steadiness that kept the family together through the tight months and the long years was hers. She did not call it sacrifice. She did not call it anything. It was just life, and she lived it with both hands, and she passed what she knew to the next woman in line, and that woman passed it on, and somewhere in that chain of passing, somewhere in the flower-dusted, garden-stained, clothesline stretched, sewing basket threaded, 60 jars cooling evening of it you are standing, and you know something that the world traded away without asking you. The way of living we have been talking about today was not just old-fashioned, it was not just simpler, it was wiser in the ways that matter. It was older than any grocery store, it was older than any company that has ever tried to sell it back to you at a markup. It was the accumulated knowledge of generations of women who figured out how to live well on what was actually there, and the figuring was its own kind of genius, and you are the proof it existed. If you remembered any of it today, any of the smells, any of the sounds, any of the particular Monday morning feeling of clean sheets coming off a line, you are carrying it. It did not die. It is in you, and that matters more than I know how to say. So here's what I want you to do this week. Just one thing. Make something you remember. It does not have to be elaborate. A pot of beans, a pan of biscuits, a loaf of bread. Start it in the morning and let it be slow. Let it fill the house with something real. And if someone asks what you're making, tell them. Tell them where you learned it. Tell them who taught you. That is how the chain stays unbroken. And then come down here to the comments and tell me about her. Tell me about the woman in your family who was number one. Your grandmother, your mother, your great-aunt who never married but could feed 14 people from a kitchen the size of a closet. Tell me her name or just what she made or what her kitchen smelled like on a cold morning. I want to hear about her. I mean that from the bottom of my heart, I want to hear about her. Next time, we are going back to the kitchens of the 1950s and the recipes that fed working families on almost nothing, the real ones with real prices and real stories. You will not want to miss it. I'm Grandma Marie. Thank you for spending this time with me. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another trip back to yesterday.